quiet hum, the recycled air, the gentle rock of the cabin. This is the sanctuary of a flight. But for one decorated airline pilot, that sanctuary was about to become a stage for prejudice. For a 17-year-old girl, it would become a crucible of humiliation. And for a local cop, it was a chance to be a hero. None of them knew that their paths were colliding with a force far greater than they could imagine. What happens when a simple accusation born from suspicion spirals into a national incident? And what happens when the mother of the accused teenager arrives, and she's the one person you never ever want to see when you've broken the law? Stay with us for a story of power, prejudice, and karma so swift and so complete, it will leave you speechless. Captain Arthur Sterling believed in order. He believed in the clear, sharp lines of a flight plan, the crisp crackle of air traffic control, and the unwrinkled collar of his pilot's uniform. For 32 years he had been the master of his domain, a pressurized aluminum tube soaring through the stratosphere. His cockpit was a sanctuary of control, his authority absolute. He had flown presidents, celebrities, and titans of industry. He had weathered storms that could tear the wings off a lesser man's aircraft and navigated landings in zero-visibility fog. Arthur Sterling was not just a pilot. He was a guardian of the skies, a man whose intuition was as finely tuned as his jet's navigational systems. Or so he told himself. Today's flight, a routine cross-country journey from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C., was smooth. The air was clear, the winds were favorable. From his elevated perch, he could see the patchwork quilt of America unfurling below. Yet a subtle disquiet gnawed at him. It hadn't come from the instrument panel or a report from the cabin crew, but from the passenger manifest he'd briefly scanned during his pre-flight checks. A name had stuck out, not for what it was, but for its placement. A last-minute booking, one way, in seat 17B. His unease, however, truly began an hour into the flight. During his mandated walkthrough of the cabin, a practice he maintained more for presence than procedure, his eyes landed on the occupant of 17B. She was a young black girl, maybe 16 or 17. She was dressed in unassuming clothes, a dark hoodie, the hood down, and jeans. But it was her intensity that snagged his attention. She was hunched over a thick, leather-bound notebook, her pen flying across the page with a feverish energy. She wasn't looking out the window, watching a movie, or listening to music. She was consumed by the book. Arthur slowed his pace, his professional smile tightening slightly. He saw strange, complex drawings filling the pages. They weren't doodles of flowers or cartoon characters. They were intricate geometric patterns, full of sharp angles, connected by webs of lines and what looked like annotations, numbers and symbols he couldn't decipher. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, her eyes darting back and forth. Every so often she would glance up, not at the people around her, but at the very structure of the airplane itself. She looked at the wing from her window, then back at her page, scribbling furiously. She craned her neck to look at the overhead bins, the emergency exit signs, the seams in the cabin walls. To the other passengers, she was invisible. Just another teenager lost in her own world. But to Captain Arthur Sterling, a man conditioned by a post-9/11 world and his own tightly wound sensibilities, alarm bells began to ring. They were faint at first, a distant chime of professional caution. He continued his walkthrough, but the image of the girl and her strange diagrams was burned into his mind. Back in the sterile quiet of the cockpit, he voiced his concern to his first officer, a younger man named David. "Something's not right in the cabin," Arthur said, his voice low and serious. David looked up from his systems check. "What do you mean, Captain?" "Seat 17B young girl. Acting suspicious." "Suspicious how?" David asked, a hint of skepticism in his voice. He had flown with Sterling enough to know the captain's definition of suspicious could be broad. "She's mapping the plane," Arthur stated, the words tasting like metal. "Drawing schematics. I saw them. Exit points, structural components. She's too focused. It's not normal." David frowned. "Mapping the plane?" Are you sure? Maybe she's just an artist or an engineering student. At 17, with that level of detail, and the way she keeps looking around, it's surveillance. Arthur's voice was firm, leaving no room for debate. His intuition, the very faculty that had kept him safe for 3 decades, was screaming at him. He saw the puzzle pieces clicking into place in his mind. The last-minute ticket, the one-way fare, the intense focus, the strange diagrams. It was a classic threat profile. He would be praised for his vigilance. He would be the hero who saw what everyone else missed. He instructed a flight attendant, a seasoned professional named Claire, to do a quiet check on the passenger. "Be subtle," he ordered over the intercom. "I just want to know what she's doing. See if you can get a better look at that book." Claire, ever the diplomat, approached seat 17B with a warm smile and an offer of a drink refill. The girl, whose name was Jordan, looked up, startled out of her concentration. Her eyes were wide and intelligent. "Oh, no, thank you," she said politely, her voice soft. She instinctively closed her notebook, pulling it protectively to her chest. Claire's smile didn't falter. "That looks like a fascinating book. Are you an artist?" Jordan hesitated. "Something like that," she murmured, offering a small, shy smile before looking back down, a clear signal that the conversation was over. Claire reported back to the cockpit. "She's very quiet. She closed the book as soon as I got there. I couldn't see the drawings, but she seemed nervous. Polite, but nervous. Nervous. It was all the confirmation Arthur needed. To him, her shyness wasn't innocence. It was the calculated concealment of a trained operative. The closed notebook wasn't for privacy. It was to hide evidence. He stewed in his conviction, the hum of the engines a low thrum of impending crisis. The world had become a dangerous place, he mused, and threats could come from the most unexpected faces. He had a duty, a solemn responsibility, to protect the 200 souls aboard his aircraft. For the next hour, Captain Sterling argued with himself, but it was a rigged debate. His bias, cloaked in the noble cloth of security, had already won. He imagined the aftermath if he did nothing, and something happened. He saw the headlines, the investigations, the ruin of his perfect record. Then he imagined the alternative, the quiet takedown on the ground, the grateful passengers, the commendation from the airline. "Dave," he said, his decision made, "patch me through to corporate security. I want to speak to Director Carmichael. And get ready to alert ground control at Reagan. We have a potential security threat on board. We're going to need law enforcement to meet us at the gate." David stared at his captain. "Arthur, are you absolutely certain about this? This could ruin that girl's life if you're wrong." "And what if I'm right?" Sterling countered, his voice cold as the air outside their window. "Whose lives will be ruined then? I'm making the call. It's my responsibility." He took the radio receiver. His voice was calm, professional, and full of a gravitas that conveyed the seriousness of his report. He detailed his observations, embellishing slightly to paint a more damning picture. He described the schematics as being highly detailed and technical. He characterized the girl's behavior not as shy, but as evasive and exhibiting counter-surveillance techniques. He was building a case, brick by prejudiced brick. Far below on the ground in Washington, D.C., his message was received. The gears of a massive security apparatus began to turn. Police units were dispatched. Airport authorities were put on high alert. And in seat 17B, Jordan, oblivious to the storm she was at the center of, finally put her pen down. She looked at her finished work, a complex and beautiful design for a new type of aerodynamic, energy-efficient drone wing, inspired by the structure of the A321 she was currently on. It was the final project for her application to a prestigious summer program at MIT. A small, proud smile touched her lips. She couldn't wait to land and call her mom to tell her she had finished it. The descent into Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport was textbook perfect. Captain Sterling executed the landing with a practiced ease that belied the tension coiled in his gut. As the Airbus A321 taxied towards the terminal, he made the standard announcement. his voice a smooth baritone that oozed authority and calm. He thanked the passengers for flying with them and wished them a pleasant stay in the nation's capital. But then he added a non-standard instruction. Ladies and gentlemen, due to a security requirement from the airport authority, we ask that you please remain in your seats after the aircraft has come to a complete stop at the gate. Please do not stand up or retrieve your luggage until you are given an all-clear by the cabin crew. We appreciate your cooperation. A ripple of confusion and muted complaint went through the cabin. Business travelers checked their watches, annoyed at the delay. Families with restless children sighed. In seat 17B, Jordan felt a flicker of anxiety. She had a car waiting for her. Her mom, despite her insane schedule, had arranged everything. She clutched her backpack, the precious notebook tucked safely inside, and simply waited, assuming it was a minor protocol issue. The jet bridge connected with a dull thud. The cabin door was opened. But instead of the usual stream of disembarking passengers, two figures stepped aboard. One was an airline ground supervisor looking flustered. The other was a uniformed police officer from the Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority Police Department. The officer, whose name tag read O'Connell, was a man who seemed built of solid, blocky muscle. He had a thick neck, a florid face, and eyes that were constantly scanning, searching for a challenge. He carried himself with the swagger of a man who believed his badge gave him dominion over all he surveyed. "Folks, we'll have this sorted out in just a moment," the supervisor announced, his voice straining to sound reassuring. Officer O'Connell didn't bother with pleasantries. He started walking slowly down the aisle, his gaze sweeping over the seated passengers. He held a piece of paper, a printout of the report from the cockpit. He was looking for seat 17B. As he approached her row, Jordan's heart began to beat faster. He wasn't looking at anyone else. His eyes, hard and accusatory, locked onto her. "You," he said, his voice loud enough for the entire midsection of the plane to hear. "Ma'am, I need you to come with me." Jordan's mind went blank. The faces of the passengers around her turned, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and alarm. "Me?" she squeaked, her voice barely a whisper. "That's what I said. Grab your things. Let's go." O'Connell's tone was aggressive, impatient. Shaking, Jordan fumbled with her backpack. She felt hundreds of eyes on her, burning into her skin. Whispers erupted around her. What did she do? She was so quiet the whole flight. You never know these days. As she stood, her legs feeling like jelly, a figure appeared behind O'Connell. It was Captain Sterling. He had emerged from the cockpit, his pilot's hat firmly on, his face a mask of grim duty. He stood with his arms crossed, observing the scene he had set in motion. He gave O'Connell a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He was the accuser and the judge presiding over the verdict. "Officer, what is this about?" Jordan asked, finding a sliver of courage. "I haven't done anything. We'll determine that at the station," O'Connell grunted, gesturing for her to move into the aisle. "Let's not make a scene here." The irony of his statement was lost on him. He was the one creating the scene, turning the airplane aisle into a public stage for her humiliation. He led her towards the front of the plane, past the rows of gawking strangers. As she passed the cockpit, her eyes met Captain Sterling's. She saw no sympathy there, only a cold, righteous certainty. It was a look that said, "I caught you." Out on the jet bridge, the scene grew worse. Two more officers were waiting. O'Connell roughly took her backpack from her. "Hey, be careful with that," Jordan cried out. "What's in here you're so worried about?" O'Connell retorted, pulling open the zipper. He rummaged through her things, a bag of chips, a textbook, a spare charger, before his hand closed on the leather-bound notebook. He pulled it out like a trophy. "This it?" he asked, looking towards the cockpit door where Sterling was still watching. Sterling nodded again. O'Connell opened the book. He flipped through the pages, his expression a mixture of confusion and contempt. He saw the intricate drawings, the complex lines, the strange annotations. He didn't understand what he was looking at, but that didn't matter. It was different. It was suspicious. It confirmed the pilot's report. "What is this stuff?" he demanded, shoving the book towards her face. "Bomb schematics? Blueprints for a weapon?" Jordan stared at him aghast. "What? No, it's a design project for a scholarship program. It's for an aerodynamic drone." "A drone?" O'Connell scoffed, a smirk playing on his lips. He turned to one of his fellow officers. "You hear that, Peterson? She says she's building drones." His tone dripped with disbelief, loudly broadcasting to everyone on the jet bridge, the ground crew, the flight attendants, the passengers still craning their necks from the plane, that her explanation was a laughable lie. "I have a letter," Jordan said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. "It's in my bag, from MIT. It explains everything." "I'm sure you do," O'Connell said dismissively, not even bothering to look. "You can tell us all your stories downtown. For now, you are being detained pending an investigation into potential terrorist threats." The words hit Jordan like a physical blow. Terrorist threats. The phrase was so monstrous, so disconnected from her reality, that she felt a wave of dizziness. This wasn't happening. This was a nightmare. She was a 17-year-old artist and aspiring engineer. She was on her way to the most important summer of her life, and now she was standing on a jet bridge, being accused of being a terrorist by a sneering police officer, while the pilot who started it all looked on with smug satisfaction. "You're making a huge mistake," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "You have no idea who you're talking to." O'Connell laughed, a loud, barking sound. "Oh, I don't, do I? And who am I talking to, the Queen of England?" "You should call my mother," Jordan said, her last resort. "Her name is Cassandra Thorne. You need to call her, right now." The officer's smirk widened. "Sure, kid. We'll let you make your phone call from the holding cell." Captain Sterling finally stepped fully out onto the jet bridge, moving to stand beside O'Connell. He looked down at Jordan, a paternalistic and condescending look on his face. "Young lady," he said, his voice dripping with false sincerity, "we take the safety of our passengers extremely seriously. If you had just been honest with the flight attendant, perhaps this could have been avoided." The injustice of it all stole her breath. He had twisted her privacy into guilt, her talent into a threat. He and this brutish cop had already tried and convicted her in the court of public opinion, right here in the cramped gray tube connecting her flight to her future. She opened her mouth to argue, to scream, but no words came out. All she could do was stare at them, her eyes flashing with a fire they mistook for defiance, but which was actually the first spark of a coming inferno. They just couldn't see the storm clouds gathering right behind them. The air on the jet bridge was thick with a toxic cocktail of smug authority and public humiliation. Officer O'Connell, basking in the glow of his perceived heroism, had one hand firmly on Jordan's arm. Captain Sterling stood beside him, a pillar of self-congratulation, occasionally murmuring to the airline supervisor about the importance of his vigilance. Jordan had fallen silent, a cold, hard knot of fury and disbelief tightening in her stomach. Arguing was useless. They had already written their script and she was the villain. It was then that the first sign of a shift in the universe appeared. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but a subtle change in the ambient noise of the airport terminal, just visible through the windows at the end of the jet bridge. The usual chaotic flow of travelers seemed to part, like iron filings before a powerful magnet. "What's going on out there?" O'Connell's partner Peterson muttered, peering towards the gate. A man in a sharp dark suit with a telltale earpiece suddenly appeared at the entrance to the jet bridge. He wasn't airport security. He was federal. His eyes, cold and efficient, swept over the scene. O'Connell's hand on Jordan, the open notebook, the smug pilot, and his face hardened into a mask of controlled urgency. "Officer O'Connell," the agent said, his voice quiet but carrying an undeniable weight of command. O'Connell, annoyed at the interruption to his power trip, puffed out his chest. "Yeah, that's me. This is a secure scene, pal. Who are you?" "I'm Special Agent Davies," the man replied, flashing his credentials so quickly O'Connell barely had time to register the seal. You need to release the girl. Now. O'Connell scoffed. Release her? On whose authority? I'm acting on a credible report from the captain of this aircraft of a potential terrorist threat. This scene is my jurisdiction. Captain Sterling stepped forward, ready to back up his star witness status. Officer, I can assure you this individual was exhibiting highly suspicious behavior. Agent Davies cut him off with a single icy glare that seemed to freeze the words in the pilot's throat. His focus returned to O'Connell. Officer, you are mistaken about your jurisdiction, and you are mistaken about the threat. His voice dropped even lower. You are making a catastrophic error. Let go of the girl. That is not a request. A second and then a third dark-suited agent appeared behind Davies, effectively blocking the jet bridge. The atmosphere changed instantly. The casual authority of a local cop was suddenly eclipsed by a palpable federal power. O'Connell's bravado began to falter, replaced by a flicker of confusion and unease. This was not the simple, open-and-shut case he had envisioned. And then she appeared. Parting the agents like the Red Sea, a woman strode onto the jet bridge. She was tall and elegant, dressed in a tailored navy blue pantsuit that spoke of power and purpose. Her hair was styled in a severe, immaculate bun, and her face, though etched with concern, was composed and formidable. She moved with a silent, ground-devouring grace that commanded the attention of everyone present. The air crackled around her. She didn't look at the agents or the pilot. Her eyes, sharp and piercing as a hawk's, went straight to Jordan, still in O'Connell's grasp. A flash of raw, maternal fury crossed her features before being instantly suppressed, replaced by an unnerving calm. "Jordan, are you all right?" she asked, her voice a low, controlled force of nature. Jordan's composure finally broke. "Mom," she breathed, the word a mix of relief and anguish. O'Connell stared, dumbfounded. Mom? This was the mother the girl wanted him to call. He had pictured some hysterical woman on the other end of a phone, not this intimidating presence. The woman's gaze shifted from her daughter to Officer O'Connell's hand on Jordan's arm. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. "Get your hand off my daughter," she said. It was a statement of fact, not a command. "The sun rises in the east, water is wet. You will remove your hand from my child." O'Connell, flustered and suddenly feeling deeply out of his depth, instinctively let go. Jordan rushed forward, and her mother wrapped a protective arm around her, pulling her close. Captain Sterling, ever the one to misread a room, decided this was his moment to reassert control and explain the situation to the girl's clearly influential mother. "Ma'am," he began, stepping forward with a patronizing air, "I am Captain Arthur Sterling. I understand this may be upsetting, but your daughter's actions on my flight were a significant security concern. I made a judgment call to protect my passengers." The woman turned her head slowly to face him. She looked him up and down, her gaze so dissecting that Sterling felt like a specimen under a microscope. The temperature on the jet bridge seemed to drop 20 degrees. "You're the pilot?" she asked, her voice dangerously soft. "I am the captain, yes," Sterling said proudly. "And you," she said, her eyes flicking to Officer O'Connell, who suddenly looked like a schoolboy caught cheating. "You are the officer in charge here?" Yes, ma'am. Officer Kevin O'Connell," he stammered. "We were just following procedure." The woman gave a short, mirthless laugh that held no humor. "Procedure," she repeated, the word sounding like an obscenity on her lips. She looked at Agent Davies. "Do they know?" Davies shook his head. "No, ma'am. They refused to listen." The woman straightened to her full height. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a leather wallet containing her credentials. She didn't flash it. She held it open for both O'Connell and Sterling to see clearly. The bold gold lettering was unmistakable. The eagle seal seemed to glitter under the harsh fluorescent lights. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Cassandra Thorne, Director. Time seemed to stop. The blood drained from Officer O'Connell's face, leaving it a pasty, blotchy white. He looked from the ID to the woman's face and back again. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He was literally speechless. Captain Sterling froze mid-pompous breath. His mind, which had been so certain, so righteous, short-circuited. The pilot, the cop, the mother, the director of the FBI. The pieces of the puzzle he thought he had assembled so perfectly shattered into a million fragments. He looked at the powerful woman in the suit, then at the teenage girl she held protectively, and then at the notebook which Agent Davies was now gently taking from O'Connell's paralyzed hand. Director Cassandra Thorne let the silence hang in the air for a few moments longer, letting the full weight of their blunder crush them. "Captain Sterling," she said, her voice now like chips of ice. "Officer O'Connell, you weren't following procedure. You were indulging in prejudice, and in doing so, you have not only terrorized my 17-year-old daughter, but you have stumbled into the middle of a national security operation in a way you cannot possibly comprehend." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Your mistake wasn't just huge, it was monumental." The jet bridge, once a stage for O'Connell and Sterling's self-important drama, had transformed into a silent, cavernous space where their careers were coming to die. The gawking passengers on the plane had been ushered off through a rear service door, leaving the key players isolated in the sterile, gray tube. Director Cassandra Thorne stood as the epicenter of a chilling calm, her arm still anchored to her daughter, Jordan. Agent Davies and his team formed a quiet, imposing perimeter. O'Connell, his face clammy with sweat, finally found his voice, though it was a reedy, pathetic version of his earlier bravado. "Director Thorne, I had no idea. We were responding to a report from the captain. He said she was drawing schematics of the plane." Director Thorne's gaze was relentless. "Show me," she commanded, nodding towards the notebook now held by Agent Davies. Davies handed the leather-bound book to his director. Cassandra opened it, her expression softening almost imperceptibly as she looked at the pages. She saw not schematics of destruction, but elegant flowing designs born of a mind she knew better than anyone. She saw her daughter's genius, her passion, her future. She turned the book around for O'Connell and Sterling to see. "You call these bomb schematics?" she asked, her voice dangerously level. "Captain Sterling, you've been flying planes for how long? 30 years? Do these look like any aircraft blueprints you've ever seen? Or do they perhaps look like the work of a gifted young woman who is a finalist for the prestigious MIT Visionaries program? A program for which she designed a prototype for a new generation of silent, energy-efficient drone wings." She flipped a page. "This annotation you found so suspicious," she pointed. "That's a fluid dynamics equation. And this?" She pointed again. "This is a note to herself about biomimicry, inspired by the wing of a dragonfly. My daughter was on this flight to attend the final round of interviews for a full scholarship. This notebook, which you treated like a terrorist's manifesto, holds the key to her entire future." Sterling stared at the drawings, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. He saw now that they were beautiful, artistic even, but his conviction had been so absolute, his pride so deeply invested, that admitting his error felt like a physical impossibility. But her behavior, the secrecy, he stammered, clinging to the wreckage of his justification. This was the moment Director Thorne had been waiting for. This was the part they could never have understood. Her face lost all trace of maternal concern and became the face of the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation dealing with a catastrophic breach. "Her secrecy, Captain," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper that was more terrifying than any shout, "was because she was following my direct orders. My daughter was traveling under a low-profile protocol. No first-class ticket, no fanfare. Just a girl on a plane. Because my family, Captain Sterling, is currently the subject of a credible death threat from the Makarov syndicate." The name landed in the space between them with the force of a body blow. Even O'Connell, a local airport cop, had heard of the Makarov syndicate. They were a brutal, transnational criminal organization involved in everything from arms trafficking to cyber terrorism. They were ghosts, notoriously difficult to pin down. Director Thorne continued, her words precise and devastating. For the last 18 months, the FBI has been running Operation Nightfall, a multi-agency effort to dismantle the Makarov leadership. We are closer than we have ever been. 2 weeks ago, their lead enforcer was apprehended in a raid, and in response, they issued a direct threat. They would target my family, specifically my daughter. She looked directly at Sterling. So, yes, she was quiet. Yes, she was protective of her belongings. Yes, she was probably nervous. She's a 17-year-old girl who knows her life is in danger. She was doing exactly as she was trained to do by my security detail. Blend in, draw no attention, and communicate with no one unless absolutely necessary. She then turned her Arctic gaze on O'Connell. And your procedure, officer involved creating a loud public spectacle at the primary arrival gate. You announced to everyone within earshot that you were detaining a potential terror suspect. You created the one thing my security team has worked for months to avoid. A scene. You put a massive spotlight on my daughter. Agent Davies stepped forward. Director, a communication from the syndicate was intercepted 40 minutes ago. It was posted on a dark web forum we monitor. It mentions a commotion at Reagan. It includes a passenger's cell phone picture of Jordan being accosted by Officer O'Connell. Jordan physically recoiled, burying her face in her mother's shoulder. The full weight of what had happened crashed down upon her. This wasn't just about humiliation anymore. This was about her life. Director Thorne's control was absolute, but a fire blazed in her eyes. So let me be perfectly clear, she said to the two pale, trembling men. Your vigilance did not stop a threat. Your vigilance created one. You blew my daughter's cover. You compromised a federal security protocol. You alerted a violent criminal organization to her exact location and appearance. You took a situation that was under control and threw a grenade into the middle of it. She took a breath, letting the silence stretch. The good news, she said with savage irony, is that you've also given Operation Nightfall an unexpected advantage. The syndicate thinks you are all incompetent local yokels. They will underestimate us. My teams are already using the data from that post to triangulate the source. Your blunder may have inadvertently helped us, but that does not in any way excuse it. She looked from Sterling's ashen face to O'Connell's quivering lip. You wanted to be heroes today. You wanted to stop a terrorist. Instead, you became the unwitting accomplices of the very people you swore to protect this country from. You weren't just wrong. You were dangerously, catastrophically, and unforgivably wrong. Sterling finally seemed to understand the chasm that had opened up beneath his feet. It wasn't just his job on the line. It wasn't just a lawsuit. He had, through his own arrogance and prejudice, endangered the child of the most powerful law enforcement officer in the country and nearly derailed a major national security operation. He felt a profound, sickening vertigo, the feeling of a man in a freefall with no parachute. In the hours and days that followed the confrontation on the jet bridge, the lives of Captain Arthur Sterling and Officer Kevin O'Connell began to dismantle, not with the sudden violence of a crash, but with the slow, grinding, and inescapable power of bureaucracy and public opinion. Director Cassandra Thorne did not need to scream or issue threats. The system she commanded, once alerted to the magnitude of the failure, began to move on its own with a terrifying and impersonal efficiency. For Captain Sterling, the first blow came before he even left the airport. He was met not by grateful airline executives, but by a stony-faced delegation consisting of the airline's chief of operations, its general counsel, and a grim-looking representative from the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA. He was not asked for his version of events. He was debriefed in a cold, sterile conference room. He was ordered to surrender his flight credentials and his airport ID. He was informed he was on immediate, indefinite, unpaid suspension pending a full investigation. The airline, panicked at the prospect of a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit and the public relations nightmare of being seen as the employer of a reckless, prejudiced pilot who had endangered the FBI director's daughter, moved with lightning speed to distance itself. Within 24 hours, their PR department issued a public statement. It spoke of a regrettable incident, an employee who failed to follow established protocols and acted on personal bias, and offered a profound and unreserved apology to the Thorne family. They announced a top-to-bottom review of their security and sensitivity training. Arthur Sterling's name wasn't mentioned, but it didn't need to be. He was the ghost haunting every line of the press release. His professional world crumbled. The pilots' union, which he had paid dues to for over 3 decades, assigned him a lawyer who, after one conversation, advised him to brace for the worst. His intuition, which he had long touted as his greatest asset, was now being dissected as a clear pattern of discriminatory behavior. Past incidents, previously dismissed as minor complaints, were re-examined. There was the time he insisted on extra security screening for a group of Sikh men, the time he reported a passenger for acting suspiciously while praying in Arabic, the time he had a Latino family's luggage searched because they were speaking excitedly in Spanish. A mosaic of bigotry, once ignored, was now being presented as Exhibit A in the case against him. The FAA investigation was even more ruthless. It was not about his prejudice. It was about his judgment. The official report, leaked to the press weeks later, was scathing. It concluded that Captain Sterling had demonstrated a profound and dangerous lack of professional judgment, had fabricated details in a security report to law enforcement, and had acted recklessly, endangering passengers and crew by creating a needless and chaotic confrontation. The final recommendation was unequivocal: the permanent revocation of his airline transport pilot license. At 58 years old, Arthur Sterling's career was over. The sky, his lifelong kingdom, was now closed to him forever. For Officer Kevin O'Connell, the fallout was just as devastating but more localized. The Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority Police Department, MWAPD, desperate to avoid the wrath of the FBI, immediately threw him under the bus. He was placed on administrative leave, a prelude to termination. But it didn't stop there. Director Thorne, in her official capacity, had requested a federal review of the MWAPD's training, procedures, and past conduct. FBI agents, the very people O'Connell had dreamed of impressing, descended on his small department. They interviewed his colleagues, reviewed his arrest records, and analyzed his body cam footage from previous encounters. They found what Thorne already knew they would: a history of excessive force complaints, a pattern of escalating minor situations, and a clear bias in his field interviews. O'Connell became a pariah in his own department. His colleagues, fearing the federal splashback, avoided him. The hero cop who had strutted onto the jet bridge was now seen as a liability, a walking embodiment of everything wrong with their unit. His partner, Peterson, gave a sworn statement that he had felt O'Connell was overly aggressive from the start. The thin blue line, he discovered, was permeable when faced with the full weight of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He tried to fight it. He claimed he was just a scapegoat, a simple cop doing his job based on what he was told by a veteran airline captain. But no one was listening. The body cam footage from the jet bridge was damning. It captured his sneering disbelief, his refusal to even look at Jordan's letter, his sarcastic and unprofessional remarks. It was a masterclass in how not to conduct a stop. Both men were savaged in the media. Their names and faces were plastered everywhere. They became symbols of racial profiling. Talk shows debated their actions. News articles dissected their backgrounds. They were turned into caricatures of white authority run amok. The public, energized by the story of the brilliant black teen and her powerful mother, showed them no mercy. They were tried and convicted in the court of public opinion long before their official disciplinary hearings were concluded. Sterling stopped leaving his house. O'Connell started drinking heavily. The swift, hard karma they faced wasn't a single event, but a continuous, grinding process that stripped them of their careers, their reputations, and their sense of self. They had built their identities on the foundations of their authority and their uniforms. Now, with those things gone, they found they had nothing left to stand on, and the ground was still sinking beneath them. The passage of time is supposed to heal, to sand down the sharp edges of memory into smooth, manageable pebbles. For Arthur Sterling, time was a corrosive acid. The 4 months since the incident on the jet bridge had not brought peace, only a more profound understanding of his own desolation. His world, once as expansive as the sky itself, had shrunk to the suffocating confines of his faux Tuscan suburban house. The silence within its walls was a living entity, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the frantic looping monologue inside his own head. He had become a curator of his own misery. The model airplanes on the mantelpiece, once symbols of his mastery over the heavens, now seemed to mock him, their sleek wings covered in a fine layer of dust he couldn't bring himself to wipe away. He'd stopped looking in mirrors. The face that stared back was not the distinguished Captain Sterling, but a sallow, haunted stranger with thinning hair and defeated eyes. He spent his days in a worn leather armchair, the television murmuring about stock prices and foreign wars. Anything to drown out the memory of director Cassandra Thorne's voice, a sound like shattering ice, and the look in Jordan's eyes, a mixture of fear and fire that burned in his memory. His wife, Margaret, was gone. Her departure had not been a single clean break, but a painful tearing away of fabric that had been woven together for 30 years. She had come back one last time, a week after the FAA had permanently revoked his license. He had been sitting in his armchair, nursing a glass of whiskey at 10 in the morning, when she walked in. She didn't rage. Her voice was quiet, weary, and carried the weight of a terrible disappointment. "I'm here for the last of my things, Arthur," she'd said, standing in the doorway of the living room, refusing to step fully inside. "Mags, please," he'd begged, the whiskey sloshing in his glass. "Don't do this. It was a mistake. One mistake." Her laugh was brittle, devoid of any humor. Was it, Arthur? Was it just one? Or was it just the first one that had consequences you couldn't escape? He stared at her, confused. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the dinner party 20 years ago, when you joked that the new neighbors, the Garcias, probably had a dozen people living in that house. I'm talking about the time you refused to fly with that co-pilot. What was his name, Amir? Because you had a bad feeling about him after he returned from visiting family in Pakistan. I'm talking about every harmless comment, every joke, every time you looked at someone who didn't look like you and saw a threat instead of a person." She took a step into the room, her eyes scanning the life they had built as if it were an archaeological ruin. "I ignored it. I enabled it. I told myself you were just old-fashioned, a product of your time. I was wrong. It wasn't old-fashioned, Arthur. It was ugly. I just didn't want to see it. That girl on the plane, she just held up a mirror to us, and God, I hate what I see." "I was protecting my passengers," he'd yelled, the familiar justification tasting like ash in his mouth. "No," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that cut him deeper than any shout. "You were protecting your own prejudice. You were so desperate to be the hero, the one who saw the danger no one else did, that you were willing to destroy a child's life to prove it. That's not a hero, Arthur. That's a monster." She had left then, and the silence that followed her departure was absolute. Her words were ghosts that now haunted the empty rooms, whispering the truth he could not face. His isolation was finally broken on a crisp November afternoon. The doorbell rang, a sharp, insistent chime that violated the tomb-like quiet. His first instinct was to hide, to pretend he wasn't there. But the ringing came again, firm and official. He dragged himself to the door and opened it to find two figures silhouetted against the pale autumn light. A man and a woman, both in unremarkable civilian clothes, but they moved with a placid confidence that screamed federal agent. "Mr. Arthur Sterling?" the man asked. His name was Agent Chen, and his expression was professionally neutral, revealing nothing. "I'm with the FBI. This is my partner, Agent Rodriguez. We'd like to ask you a few questions. This is not about your pending civil litigation." The mention of the lawsuits made Sterling's stomach clench. He stepped back numbly, letting them into the house that Margaret had once filled with flowers and life. They sat on the sofa opposite his armchair, turning his sanctuary into an interrogation room. "We'd like you to walk us through the events of Flight 447 one more time," Agent Chen began, his voice calm and disarming. "From the moment you first noticed the passenger in 17B. Wearily, Sterling recounted the story he had told a dozen times to lawyers and investigators. He spoke of his intuition, the girl's suspicious intensity, the strange diagrams, the clandestine glances at the plane structure. He tried to inject his tale with the righteous certainty he had felt that day, but the words came out hollow, pathetic even to his own ears. He was a general recounting a lost battle, desperately trying to frame his defeat as a strategic retreat. When he finished, the agents were silent for a moment. Then Chen leaned forward slightly. "It's interesting, Mr. Sterling. In all your official statements, you've been very clear that your suspicion was based solely on your own observations during the flight. Is that correct?" "My training, my intuition." "Yes," Sterling affirmed weakly. "So nothing and no one influenced your thinking before the flight?" Rodriguez asked, her eyes sharp and focused. "No, of course not." Agent Chen placed a small tablet on the coffee table between them. He swiped the screen, and a video began to play. It was security footage from the crew lounge at LAX the night before the flight. It showed Sterling at a small table, nursing a coffee, going over his flight plan. A man in a ground crew manager's uniform approached him. Sterling recognized him instantly. Frank Coleman, a loud, boisterous man he'd known casually for years. "Do you remember this conversation, Mr. Sterling?" Chen asked. "Vaguely," Sterling lied, his heart beginning to thrum with a new, unfamiliar anxiety. "Frank, we just chatted for a minute. About the new union rules, I think." "Try to remember more clearly," Rodriguez urged, her voice gentle but firm. "It's important." And as he stared at the screen, the memory, suppressed by the trauma and shame of the aftermath, began to surface. It wasn't about union rules. Frank had sat down, his face a mask of weary camaraderie. He had steered the conversation to security. "It's a crazy world, Art, isn't it?" Frank had sighed, shaking his head. "You can't be too careful these days. They're getting smarter, bolder." Heard a whisper from a guy in TSA. "They're training them so young now, using academic covers, all sorts of things to look innocent." Sterling remembered nodding, agreeing fervently. It validated everything he already believed. "Yeah," Frank had continued, leaning in conspiratorially. "Word is there was a girl, sharp as a tack, brilliant even, who got flagged on an international watch list but somehow slipped through the cracks on a domestic flight plan. Can you believe the incompetence? They say she looks like any other kid, probably carrying her work in a notebook or a laptop. You just never know who's sitting back there." The memory hit Sterling with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't sought out the threat. The threat had been gift-wrapped and handed to him. The seed had been planted in the fertile, prejudiced soil of his mind. He looked up from the tablet, his face pale. He was talking about her? "He was talking about a phantom he created for you, Mr. Sterling," Agent Chen said, his voice losing its gentle edge. "Frank Coleman has a $30,000 gambling debt owned by a collector for the Makarov syndicate. For the last 2 years, he has been a paid informant, feeding them information. When Director Thorne's team got close to their leadership, the syndicate ordered a public incident involving her family. They wanted to rattle her, to discredit her by making her seem unable to protect her own. Agent Rodriguez took over. They studied you, Mr. Sterling. They knew your record. They knew your propensity for vigilance. Coleman was tasked with finding a way to put Director Thorne's daughter in the spotlight, and he realized the easiest way was to let you do it for him. He didn't order you to do anything. He just baited the hook, knowing you would bite." Chen laid out the final, damning pieces of evidence. Coleman's bank records showing deposits from an untraceable shell corporation, transcripts of encrypted messages, and finally his full confession upon being arrested that morning. The floor fell away from Arthur Sterling's world. This was the final, most exquisite form of karma. It wasn't just that he had lost everything. It was that he had lost it all in the service of his enemies. His righteous crusade was a lie. His intuition was a character flaw that had been expertly exploited. He wasn't the captain of his own destiny. He was a gullible, bigoted puppet whose strings had been pulled by a low-level airport manager and a distant cabal of criminals. The pride he had clung to, the last vestige of his identity, was annihilated. He had been so proud of his own supposed perception, and he had seen nothing at all. He was a fool, a weapon that had been aimed and fired without its knowledge. He began to laugh, a dry, horrifying sound that echoed in the silent house. It was the sound of a man's soul cracking apart. Miles away, the air was filled not with silence, but with the hum of servers, the excited chatter of brilliant minds, and the soft whir of a prototype in a wind tunnel. Jordan Thorne watched the smoke trails flow gracefully over the drone wing she had designed. The complex equations she had scribbled on the plane were now a physical reality, a thing of beauty and function. She was explaining her data to a first-year student, a nervous boy who looked at her with awe. "You see?" she said, pointing to a screen full of data. "If you adjust the curvature just slightly here, you reduce the drag coefficient by another 2%. Don't be afraid to trust the math, but also trust the shape. Sometimes the most elegant solution is also the most efficient." Her phone buzzed. It was her mom. She answered with a wide smile. "Hey, Mom, you won't believe the numbers we're getting." "I always believe in your numbers, honey." Cassandra Thorne's voice came through, warm and full of pride. "I just called to see how you were. Are you eating?" "Yes, Mom." Jordan laughed. They talked for 10 minutes about classes, friends, and the terrible food in the dining hall. The incident was never mentioned. It was a part of their history, a closed chapter. It had taught Jordan a harsh lesson about the world, but it had also shown her the depth of her mother's love and the strength of her own spirit. The world's ugliness had touched her, but it had left no stain. As she hung up, she looked at the wing spinning in the tunnel. She had taken the structure of an airplane, the very thing that had been the vessel of her humiliation, and transformed its principles into something new, something better. It was her future. Back in his silent house, Arthur Sterling sat alone in the dark. He was a man with no future, and now a man with a poisoned past. He had flown through countless storms, but he had finally found the one from which there was no escape, the storm within himself. And in its devastating wake, there was nothing left. That's a wrap on this incredible story of pride, prejudice, and the powerful arrival of karma. It's a stark reminder that our biases are not just quiet thoughts. They can be weapons, sometimes wielded by us, and sometimes, as we saw with Captain Sterling, used against us by forces we can't even see. The pilot and the officer thought they held all the power, only to discover they were standing in the shadow of a giant. Jordan's story is one of resilience, of a bright young mind refusing to be defined by someone else's ignorance and rising above it all to achieve her dreams. What did you think of Director Thorne's epic arrival, and how satisfying was that final twist? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who loves a good karma story, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more real-life drama that will have you on the edge of your seat. Thanks for listening.